Business has become more global, and we work in organizations with diverse cultures. As a leader, how do we communicate with impact across these cultures? How do we speak, sound, and look like a leader while maintaining our cultural intelligence? I'm Linda Katz-Wollner, founder of Successfully Speaking, and I'm so excited to interview Kristin Joy Ekkens. Kristin is the founder and CEO of Exponential Inclusion. We met many years ago at a TESOL convention, and that's a convention for speakers of other languages, teachers for speakers of other languages. And I always appreciated Kristin's passion for what she was doing. I've followed her over the years on LinkedIn and saw how her work has evolved. This topic is such a special place in my heart because I have worked for decades with non-native American English speakers. And so this aligns so much with the work that I do. Welcome, Kristin.
Linda, thank you. It's just such a pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, and a long time coming.
A long time coming.
So, Kristin, why don't we start with how did you evolve to this point?
So, it was fascinating to me, actually, when I look back to see how it's evolved. I've had to reflect on this over the years to say, now, how did I get here? And it really started with doing 10 years or so working in the space of non-native speakers of English that I'm teaching, but then also coordinating and directing a workplace English program. So I worked with employees who were in all different industries, but they were typically, most of them were in manufacturing. Most of them were trying to figure out, how do I improve my skills, my English skills, so that I can actually land in the profession that I'm trained in? Many of them immigrants and refugees coming from all around the world, landing and finding them in a space that they were putting together cell phones, for example, or painting bumpers of cars, finding themselves in positions that weren't their heart's dream to be in, but it made ends meet for their family. So to me, it was a heart. How would I put this? This was something that was so close to my heart, to help people see how they can live to be personally at their higher self, work towards that, be their best, and knowing that these individuals, the skill they needed was English in order to help them at least move in that step to where they wanted to be, and to be financially sound for their families and not work multiple jobs. So fast forward, all of a sudden, I saw as the language skills improved, there was a huge gap with managers and supervisors either not seeing the language improving or not having their eyes opened to what that actually looked like. And so I saw there was bias and a gap there.
The fact that you're saying that, and that has become so much more apparent to me over the years, because I've always worked on the accent modification.
Yes.
And now I change my course because it's okay to have an accent if you're communicating effectively. And you're right about that accent bias.
Yes.
And that brings us to, I mentioned in the beginning, cultural intelligence. And there are so many types of emotional IQ and intellectual IQ. Tell us a little bit to start with.
Yes.
How do you define cultural intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the capability to work and relate effectively across cultures. That's the technical definition. Now, what that actually means is it's a learned skill. So these are actually skills that every single individual, every human can learn to improve how to work and relate across national divides, across ethnic divides, even generational, gender, socioeconomic. So all of the things that make us us when we talk about diversity, cultural intelligence actually picks up where emotional intelligence leaves off. And so I love that way of putting it, because emotional intelligence helps us when we're working with people who are typically coming from the same culture as us or same background. We can say something or read the cues on their face, their expressions. We can hear their tone, and we can understand it similarly, not always, but similarly to what they're expressing it. When you're moving across cultures, that's just not the case. Someone can make a facial expression, look you in the eye or not look you in the eye, and we make a judgment based on that and decide, what do I do next in response? And so that's where there's so many gaps,
Mhm.
and it causes so much miscommunication.
Well, absolutely. And early in my career, I heard of it a lot in healthcare because
Yes.
that's where I started, with doctors who were even saying, I'm from India, but I'm working in the United States. And I had to learn to have eye contact with my patients because I would defer to them. If they were older than I was, I wouldn't look at them.
Yes.
But the American patient was upset. So it's fascinating. And I saw this early in my career, and it's only become more complex, I think.
Absolutely. And that's actually one more space I worked quite a bit in healthcare. So I actually led inclusion and diversity. So when you asked in the beginning where it went to, it started with the nonprofit world and working with the immigrants and refugees, moved into healthcare, and I led inclusion and diversity, and moved from working with only individuals to systems design work and figuring out, how do we actually change the system so that we can be more inclusive of all different communities, create a more inclusive future for all. And fast forward, I actually went and worked in Silicon Valley area, worked with executives around the world, now have been able to embed a lot of innovation techniques and design thinking into the work that I do with companies around the world. But it's important to say where I started, because that's the foundation and still a heart passion to say, this is what's the why behind actually, whether it's, helping people communicate more effectively, and that's, as we talked about, the eye, looking people in the eye, but it could be handshakes. It could be the actual words we use, the linguistics, and the semantics behind that. Yes.
Gestures.
The gestures are a key piece to this, but it's also even our tone of voice and the pace that we go. And are we adapting? This is the major piece around cultural intelligence. There's actually 4 skills that I'll only describe very briefly right now, but the 4 skills, the first is motivation. It's called CQ drive. So when I say CQ, cultural intelligence, in short, like EQ, because it's built off of a similar framework, it's CQ. So CQ, a quotient, cultural quotient. When we're actually building that, your drive is critical. Are you motivated, especially when stress hits? And this is key, because any one of us can have a higher level of cultural intelligence, but when stress hits, when we're not feeling well, when we are, maybe it's a project that's gone wrong, maybe in healthcare, it's a patient that is causing stress for the physician. Any of these things can make us lose in a moment that level of cultural intelligence and just react.
Because we go to our natural response.
Yes, yes,
And our
absolutely.
natural bias, perhaps.
Yes. So this is where training ourselves to respond with cultural intelligence is key to communicating with impact across cultures. It's key, because if we miss out on this first skill of motivation, then we basically stopped and undercutted ourselves and the outcome, the positive outcome that can happen. So having our energy up and being able to have drive is key. The next skill is CQ knowledge. And when we can build our understanding, this is typically where people think of, if I'm going to work across cultures, I better know more about that culture. And what I'll say is yes, and yes, you need to know more, but it's dangerous if you stop there. So you need to know more, but only knowing won't help how you actually interact. So the next key thing is CQ strategy. And this is where we reflect on what we've done. We see ourselves in the moment, or we ask someone else to help us see in the moment. So a cultural coach or cultural broker. And we then reflect on what happened. How can I do that better? What happened in that moment? So CQ strategy is a critical component of cultural intelligence. And then the final one, just briefly, is called CQ action. And CQ action is what it sounds like, how you take action, but it's all about your behaviors. And are you adapting or not adapting? And when do you choose to adapt? And when do you choose not to adapt, to be your authentic self still? So those are the 4 skills.
And there is so much to learn. And it reminds me that early in my career working in healthcare, I thought that I knew a lot about the competency of other cultures, cultural competency.
Yes. Yes.
And so I could give you a list. All right, I'm working with a client who's from China. This is what that person's going to do. And it's later in maybe the past 10 years where I said, wait a minute, it is so much more complex, because what's my culture? What's their culture? How are they going to be to the nurse who's a different culture?
Yes.
And it seems like there are so many layers to this onion to peel.
So many layers, and it can be stressful for people when they start to think about, do I have to know about all of these cultures? I cross so many cultures every single day.
Mhm.
And what I would say is, no, you don't have to know every single culture, but what you have to have, and this is where cultural intelligence comes in, you know where to find the tools.
Mhm.
And you first work on getting that energy up and the drive up to actually work through a situation. Then you see and you know, where do I find the tools to learn more? But you're planning your interactions and figuring out where to adapt, all before you have this encounter, and in the moment and afterward. It's this combined effort that you need to have throughout, but it's so well worth it. The leaders that I've seen that have used cultural intelligence and improved and always work on improving their cultural intelligence, they are communicating with impact. And that's
Mhm.
not to mean they always do it right.
Mhm.
You know, we all are human, so we will mess up. Our bias will step in,
Sure.
right? But they're doing it more often than others.
And it sounds like it's that willingness
That's
to
huge.
stop, look at maybe the reaction that that person had, and reflect on yourself. Like, what did I say to trigger that?
Yes, absolutely. And you might be someone who has a high level of empathy, and you're seeing a reaction and you're not fully understanding it. And yet, I can't answer this question because I don't know this culture very well.
Mhm.
The thing that I see leaders with high cultural intelligence, they seek out someone then to help them.
Mhm.
So whether that is someone from that culture who understands their culture as well, or maybe it's someone who is a cultural coach and they do this for a living, right? And they
Mhm.
can help steer and say, this is what I'm seeing.
Mhm.
But I see all of this as, there's not a right and wrong. And I think this is key to this work. These are experiments that we are doing on a daily basis. They're micro experiments. Every interaction we have with every human being is a micro experiment. And if we can just continue to learn from and pivot when we need to,
Mhm.
that allows us to actually communicate with impact.
That's wonderful. And I've been hearing the term lately of cultural humility. You
Yes,
don't assume that the way you're doing it is the right way and everybody has to come to your side.
that's right.
Look at these cultures and understand it. And that's so important today, isn't it?
It is cultural humility. It's really under the same umbrella
Mhm.
as cultural intelligence, these different approaches we take. I would say one of the things that I typically change, and you mentioned with healthcare,
Mhm.
often they'll talk about cultural competency. And yes, I've done a lot of training in that space, but where I found that that misses the mark when we just talk about it. And cultural competency is kind of an umbrella term if we talk about it actually in the right
Mhm.
way. But often we think about it as knowing more about cultures. So
Mhm.
again, going back to that, it's not enough.
Right.
So, so this is where I do find it, um, for me, it comes down to, how can we help connect humanity? And I know this gets on a big, huge scale, right?
Mhm.
But my actual mission in my company, Exponential Inclusion, is to grow the way that we connect and bridge the disconnects.
Mhm.
So if we can actually connect on a human level, and this is understanding each other, even though we have different points of views, even though we come from very different backgrounds, working together for a greater global good.
Mhm.
That's truly what it needs to come to,
Mhm.
in my mind. And so I do a lot of social impact work with companies, but it comes down to first connecting one-on-one with each individual, then in teams, how we collaborate, organizations, how they do, and then on the scale of humanity coming together.
Mhm. That's wonderful.
Mm.
Now, you mentioned there are sometimes you're talking about leaders and teams. Sometimes there will be barriers or blockers. Can you give some examples of how that might look?
Yes, yes. So sometimes I have found when I go into a company, for example, and let's say it's a high performing team. I had this summer actually. I was working with a client, and they were a very high performing team. However, they really were struggling to figure out, as they came from different ways of working even. So this is one of the things with cultural intelligence. It's actually crossing functional positions, like where you work within an organization. So this team was high performing, but they were meant to go out and work with other teams in the organization.
Mhm.
And they were helping them innovate in those different areas. So what marketing looks like and believes is different from accounting, is different from
Mhm.
sales, is different from operations, and how you speak to each of those teams or departments within an organization has to change. So if
Mhm.
you actually want functionally even groups to hear your message, to understand what you're saying, to come along with you if you're trying to influence them, you actually need to use cultural intelligence and adapt how you're speaking to them,
Mhm.
what words you're actually using to help them connect. Is it the head? Is it the heart? Is it a combination of both? What will grab their attention first and allow you to have more impact with them? So that's one example.
And right, that's amazing, the layers and what you need to do. And that's interesting. You said across different parts of the company because they will have different ways to communicate. And it comes down to know your audience.
It does.
Know your audience.
Huge part of knowing your audience. Absolutely.
And something, as you started talking, reminded me of a situation when I was working with a client and the manager, when I touched base with the manager to see how he thought the client was doing, he said, I just wanted to speak up in meetings.
Yeah.
And I said, did you realize that that's not part of his culture? That he happened to be from Ethiopia and he wasn't going to jump in on the meetings. And then the client would complain to me that Americans just talk to talk. So it was very interesting. So obviously the motivation might have been there, but for the manager, but not the knowledge.
Yes.
It
And
was
and
it
this
hadn't
is
been there.
Yes, I love that you bring that up because it really comes down to shared expectations.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, they'll just keep missing the mark with each other if they're saying, well, I don't do this usually. And the other person says, I don't do this usually. And to come together to actually collaborate on that,
Mhm.
there may be things that each one of them need to do that they're crossing over and it makes them uncomfortable to do it. But
Mhm.
if one person is crossing over all the time, this is where there will be burnout. There
Mhm.
will be resentfulness potentially. There will be, I'm going to leave because this isn't the right job for me or manager for me or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
So that's where I see if they're not connecting, it's figuring out who's adapting, when do you need to adapt. It comes down
Mhm.
to that.
So we're talking about leaders here. What should a leader do if
Mm.
there is that problem?
I do see that it is the leader who should be the one bringing the conversation to the employee to
Mhm.
say, how do we do this more effectively?
Mhm.
And it's not to say, this is how we do it more effectively, but in a collaborative way to figure out, even if it's uncomfortable for them,
Mhm.
figure out together saying, it's the leader's job to say, this is how I see this. How do you see it?
Mhm.
Because then you can find where the biggest disconnects are. And actually, this is where I help short circuit some of the miscommunication before it happens. Is often I'll have leaders, have teams take an assessment that they can actually look and see before it happens. I can
Mhm.
help interpret it for them to say, here are some future potential challenges you will have, right? And here I can see where you might have some really strong synergies or major gaps because you're all thinking the same way.
Mhm.
So how do you interrupt that way of thinking when it's groupthink, for example? So that's a key piece that we look at together.
And that's so important for me,
Mm.
working with the people who then have to report to these leaders, that it behooves me to connect with the leaders to share these expectations and encourage the client to speak to their leader as well.
That's
I'm
right.
not always working with the leader. I'm sometimes working with the person who reports.
I love that point, because even though I do feel it falls for the leader to take action first, often we don't have access to that person. And so there can be influencing up that happens from the client, the employee, whoever it is that you're working with, that they can actually say, this is something I've learned, not just around how I'm learning to communicate more effectively, but one of the ways that I can do this is actually show you how I see this challenge, or what gap I see happening right now. And I'd love your perspective on this. And so if they can influence up in a way to show what they're seeing, and even I've had some of my clients take their assessment results that they've gone through. So I do a program with Latinos who are leaders, and they bring their results to their leader. And we've had this multiple times over the last 10 years that they've said, this is who I am. And I see these are where some of the challenges in our communication have been. I'd love to understand how I can adapt even more, and where we might actually, though, work together even more effectively. And then the leader is able to shift also how they see it. It was information they just didn't have before. A gap in knowledge, right? There's no blaming. There's no shaming. There's none of that. It's more of a, let's work more effectively.
Right. Somebody may be totally unaware that there's a problem.
That's right. Exactly.
Here's another scenario, Kristin. I'm a new leader of a company, and it's a global organization. How do I gain confidence that I can deal with these multicultures? It may not be one other culture. It may be several, like you mentioned before.
Yes.
What are some tips?
Yes. That's typically what I find, actually, because I think speaking effectively comes, one huge piece is the confidence behind it. And so part of confidence is actually that first skill of CQ drive. So when we're assessing on it, it's not only your energy level, it's not only your motivation, but it's actually part of your motivation is, am I confident enough to do that? We call self-efficacy. So if they don't have enough self-efficacy, they may not put themselves out there to test and explore and experiment. So I would say some of the things that I recommend is, even one of the basic things is, make a goal for yourself. And I'm a high performance coach. So I say, like, okay, make a goal for yourself, and when's the deadline you're going to do this by, right? Create new habits. So maybe it's once a month that you go and meet with someone who's from a different culture than yourself. And you get to know them. You just ask some questions, and it could be incredibly uncomfortable for some people. And you can do it virtually. But you're trying to say to them, I'm learning more about other cultures. Would you be willing to spend 30 minutes with me so that we can learn from each other? And I'd love to get to know you a little bit better. Now, there are more dynamics in this. There's power dynamics that happen if it's a leader to an employee. But maybe you start with leader to leader and find other people who are directors, let's say, if you are, of global, departments. Then get to know them some. And actually, that's one of the things that I've been working on creating, is ways that people from different organizations can come together in communities. And one of the things I'm launching in 2024 is a mastermind that we can actually do this. And it's called El Camino Mastermind, because it's not for the weary. It is for those who want to learn more effective communication skills, culturally learn about people who are very different from them, because people will be coming from all around the world. But we're actually hiking El Camino de Santiago at the very end of this, which is in northern Spain. So deep human connection.
Right, that is in those situations, you make lots of connections.
Yes, you do. You are learning and growing together physically, mentally, spiritually, all of the things as you go through this hiking process, and in the mastermind prior to.
And who will lead the way and hold my hand?
Yes.
So Kristin, there's so much I want to ask you, and so many questions, but I do want to limit the time of this interview. And there's one question that I always like to ask, and that is, what do you see is an essential skill if you can think of one essential skill to speak, sound, and look like a leader who has cultural intelligence.
The one thing I would say, I mean, if I can't say all, will just be more culturally intelligent, right? Easier said than done. One thing out of all of that is pause. Just pause. Don't react. When you feel that, and this is how I talk about it, usually our body reacts to it first. And so it's different for different people, but sometimes it's the gut reaction that we have and you feel it. And sometimes for me, for example, that gut reaction heads straight to my face. My face gets red, I might blush or whatever it might be. But I know that my body is reacting. For some people, they may sweat. For some, they just feel tenseness in their body. What I say then is anytime you feel the slightest bit of this, when you're having a conversation with someone, then pause. Don't say anything in the moment. Just think through and reflect on what's happening in your body. And within even 2 seconds, if you pause, you can react with a more culturally intelligent response.
Kristin, you have no idea how important that answer is to me, because that's what I teach in my training.
Amazing.
The pause model. And the only thing I add is you pause and you also breathe. But I only asked you once. You only had one.
Yeah, I couldn't say breathe, but that is absolutely the next thing.
That is the heart of what I teach.
We're so aligned, Linda.
So it's amazing that you said that, and we know that there was no prep for that.
No prep for that.
But that's such a great model and such a great way to finish this or pause this discussion. We'll have another one, I'm sure. And Kristin, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, yes. Probably the best way, I am on LinkedIn. They can find me there, but I think the best way to learn about some of the things that we're doing to help to connect people and to communicate more effectively is go to my website. And that's www.exi.global.
Okay, and that will be posted at the end of the interview.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Linda. This was such a pleasure.
This is wonderful. It's been so many years since I first met you, and I'm so excited to see how it has evolved, because it seems like you've pulled all those pieces together, and it's so much in alignment with what I care about as well.
Absolutely. Such a joy. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you.